Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And we're here talking about the creation of a Treaty Implementation Commissioner. Some background. I was the Chief Counsel of Housing Nation Council for 6 years. Prior to that, I was a council for 8 years. That 8-year period, I was actually a treaty chairman under the BC treaty process. So I was negotiating the treaty. So I read all the announcements over the last 20 years. I went to all the meetings. I read all the reports. And I read all the different positions being created to address very simple issues. And for those who don't understand treaty and how it's evolved, basically a treaty is a formal agreement signed between BC, Canada, and First Nations, and has evolved to basically formalize Aboriginal rights and title. And underneath that, case law that was established in the courts of BC and Canada, reconciliation. Now, that term is used loosely all over Canada, especially by politicians, for everything under the sun. But when you look at case law, reconciliation has a meaning. It's how to marry Aboriginal rights and title interests with Crown interests, meaning legislation regulations. Now, under undefined rights and title, which is what we're finding in cases like Cowichan, for example, it's complicated. I'll give you that. But a treaty defines those rights and title in a very prescriptive manner, including implementation. There are implementation provisions in the treaty of modern-day treaties. So why are we creating another position, another level of bureaucracy when it's already spelled out in the modern-day treaties? I've heard the awakening speeches from the Liberal government talking about social issues tied with economic development issues, which is great. I'm glad they've finally woken up to that reality, especially in First Nations regions, because we've been talking about that for the better part of 20 years. And before the 2004 court case came along, First Nations really did not have a seat at the table. It was the Haida court case of 2004 that defined the role of the Crown in dealing meaningfully with Aboriginal rights and title interests, even if it hadn't been proven. By the way, the Haida First Nation where I come from, we intervened in that court case. That Haida court case turned things around for my band. We went from one of the poorest First Nation communities in BC to one of the most wealthiest and one of the most successful. And more importantly, we resolved poverty. We resolved unemployment. And all those social issues, the violence of poverty, that started to go away. I am incredibly proud of that. In fact, I would love to see some type of report done on that. We're not talking about those social issues that many other First Nations are talking about anymore, just because we engaged in the economic fabric of Canada and BC. But it's the politics that have held us back. The legislation created in places like this and in Victoria that many people don't understand and don't follow, and I don't blame them, especially today. They're out there trying to make life more affordable. They're trying to find a job, especially our young people who are reaching higher levels of unemployment. They've got their own issues. So part of my job, I believe, is to describe what is happening here in terms of legislation and describe how it affects the individual, which is extremely hard. Now, a lot of people will think, implementation of treaty, oh, that's such a great thing. They're going to create a commissioner. Well, the commissioner's got no authority. Basically, what the commissioner is going to do is take those decades of complaints of First Nations, formulate it into a report, and give it to government. And if government is going to be repeating their past behavior, they're going to ignore it. Or they're going to come up with some type of word salad speech just for the perception that they're actually doing something. When really these First Nation leaders are coming to the table in good faith, to not only to resolve their issues, but to sign a treaty. They're moving from a place of undefined Aboriginal rights and title that requires consultation, and they think they're moving into an arena where they're going to be treated as an equal partner to Canada and BC. Niska Nation, in my region, has had a treaty for over 20 years. They were the first to complain of the tanker ban that restricted their economic future. A treaty partner of Canada, but Canada did it anyway. Now Niska, to be clear, they weren't supporting the transport of oil. They weren't doing that. They just thought that the treaty outlined specific roles and responsibilities between their nation, their treaty nation, and the government of Canada. That's all they wanted. They expected more because the provisions of the treaty said so. And treaty bans, unless you're gifted with location as an asset, is really tough to implement alone by itself without an economic base. Now, for some treaty bans that are close to urban centers, an economic base isn't that much of a problem, especially if land values are high, like in Vancouver. But for remote bans that sign onto a treaty, there's provisions in the treaty where at some point you're going to have to get off government funding. So the whole point of signing onto a treaty is to formalize an agreement between Canada and BC, but also to get away from the Indian Act. To get away from Indian Act funding. Everybody talks about dependence. Well, for the most part, the Indian Act is irrelevant. Nobody's going to enforce those archaic provisions. But the funding agreements still hold First Nations dependent on government funding. Treaty bans get government funding as well, but there are provisions where they have to develop their own source revenue. That is hard to do. That is really hard to do. You think about a typical band, maybe 800 on reserve, 800 off reserve. Their funding agreement probably amounts to $7 million a year, $8 million a year. I've been away from council for quite a while, so I'm not quite sure myself. But the provisions of the treaty expect you to replace that funding and be independent of government funding. Now, there are extra costs to that because Indian Act funding is formulated in a way where you don't really get the entire cost covered by Indian Act funding. If you need $100, the Indian Act will provide you 70, and you got to figure out the rest. That goes for water, sewer, administration, health. So First Nations are always continuously trying to make up the difference. And by the way, under the Indian Act, if you produce a deficit, you will get punished. There'll be clawbacks, or there'll be a cessation of programs, right? But here's the thing. In certain funding agreements under the Indian Act, if you produce a surplus, and it's not entirely under the criteria of what government expects, you get punished. You can't win or lose with Indian Act agreements, so it's no wonder First Nations are trying to find a way out. Whether it's leveraging their Aboriginal rights and title to be engaged in the economy to create their own source of revenue, or they sign a treaty. In either way, these First Nation leaders are still trying to resolve one central thing. How do we resolve poverty? And all the violence of poverty that accompanies that. This is not new. I became treaty chairman in 2003. I used to go to the summit meetings in Vancouver, in Musqueam. They were talking about this back then. Not only in terms of implementing treaty, in a signed treaty, but actually in the provisions that we're negotiating at the time. I don't see how a commissioner is going to change this when it's just another office to pass a message on to government that, hey, government, you're not doing your job. That's what it boils down to. I mean, I've heard Liberal members getting up and talking about this new era of partnership in building the economy to combat Trump's tariffs. Then why have you opposed economic development for the last 10 years? Why did you create Bill C-69? Why did you create Bill C-48? We've already heard energy experts saying that you can't be an energy superpower without oil and gas. That our dependence as a country on the United States, taking our oil and gas at a discount, is going to limit our ability not only to diversify our economy, but also to limit us in becoming an energy superpower. First Nations are already there. We've been there for the last 20 years. If you look at the Haida court case of 2004, there's a specific clause that says there's an economic component of rights and title that must be respected. That's in relation to the land. Now, First Nations get it. They've got to make a trade-off, and they've been willing to make that trade-off. They've got a specific parcel of land, and in their past practices might have been subject to ceremonial purposes, or food gathering, or hunting, or fishing. They get it. But they're also looking at the ravages of poverty, especially on reserve, and even for that matter, off reserve. So First Nations have been pushing for economic development in all sectors as much as they could. Who stops them? The Liberal government with their legislation. I already outlined the Niska Treaty, your partner, who has a higher level than just consultation of Aboriginal rights and title, because they have defined rights and title. They signed a constitutionally protected document with Canada and BC that said Niska is a partner of Canada and BC. They didn't do it just for the glory of signing a treaty. They thought they could build a better future for their people. That's why they did it. And they're doing a great job. At the same time, every modern-day treaty agrees to abide by the laws of BC and Canada. It's called the paramountcy of laws. They're agreeing to that. Meaning, if you go onto treaty territory in a modern-day treaty, you're not going to come into a brand new country with their own set of laws regarding speeding or crimes. You're not going to get that. They trade their undefined rights and title for that because they want to be a partner. Most First Nation leaders see that the issues we're facing as Aboriginals are the same issues Canadians are facing right now. We're in this together. And as, like a judge said, let's face it, none of us are going anywhere. First Nations want better medical services just like everybody else. They want better highways, better schools. They want that. Treaty bands are subject to taxation. They don't want higher taxes. And if they do submit taxes, they want to see those taxes being used responsibly, just like non-Aboriginals in Canada. So somehow, this newfound idea of partnership with First Nations and economic development for Canada, coming from the Liberals, sounds disingenuous, given the past 10 years. But it is more important than ever. More important. Because as we go in to a limited economy, stifled by legislation and regulations, combined with unmanageable deficits, with no plan to pay off the debt, Canada's going down a dangerous road. I can tell you, as an Aboriginal coming off reserve, I can't believe that there's more people not talking about this. Other countries have proven what happens when you base your decisions entirely on politics. You think the cost of living is bad now? Go to a place like Venezuela where they base their entire system on politics. And now they're selling their resources for a penny a dollar. And you got to take a wheelbarrow of cash just to go buy a loaf of bread. Governance is serious stuff, and I do get the politics. I understand it. But if you keep making political decisions and not thinking about the future of our country, present day and future, Canadians will pay for that for decades, for generations. You're talking about treaty implementation. When I was a treaty negotiator and while I was a chief counsel, it was made clear to me, you make decisions based on 7 generations in the future. And we didn't have the luxury of spinning the truth. Or at least I didn't. Maybe I did have the opportunity, but I didn't go down the road. And yes, a lot of my policy decisions were not liked, but I was doing it for a reason. There was issues I wanted to resolve. But I also wanted to leave a better place for my descendants. It turns out that LNG Canada was a good decision, even though politicians rejected it. For decades, the BC NDP in BC made outrageous claims of why LNG was bad. If you approve LNG, Victoria is going to be underwater. That's what they said. The Liberals said there's no business case for LNG. They told that to Germany. Meanwhile, we're trying to wave over here going, hey, wait a minute. We got LNG in our Canada in our territory. We got Chevron, who was chased out. That was a $30 billion project. They were chased out. 18 projects in BC. All but 3 left BC. Now the Liberal government is talking the reverse side of it now. We need an economy. We need LNG. Maybe we'll become an energy superpower, but we're not going to talk about how. We're going to build oil pipelines, but we're not going to build oil pipelines. All this mixed messaging, all this wordsmithing, all this truth spinning, it's going to hurt Canadians. And this existential crisis that Trump has created is not an opportunity for more politicking. It's a time to think about us as a country. Where did we come from? It's a pretty messy picture when you talk about where we came from, when you're talking about Aboriginal interests. But if you're anything like me, I do acknowledge the past. I do understand the wrongdoings. But I learned a long time ago it's better to build a future. It's easy to tear down. The Liberals have already torn down our economy by saying no oil tankers on the west coast of BC, even though there's tankers on a daily basis coming down the west coast of British Columbia, from Alaska to Washington State. No mention of that. And by the way, Washington State, along with some of the oil that they get from Alberta, they'll refine that into gas, diesel, jet fuel, and sell it back to Canada for incredible profits. The United States has become an energy superpower for exporting oil and gas for domestic purposes and export. Where do they get a large part of their supply? Canada, at a discount. Treaty First Nations are there. They've been begging for the government to stop ignoring them. All we're saying to the government, do your job. Don't create another level of bureaucracy for a message to come from the commissioner to the government to say, do your job. First Nations want to build Canada just like everybody else. Come on, Canada, just do your job.
Questions and comments. Question commentaire. The Honourable Chief Government Whip.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the member for his intervention today. Bill C-10 is part of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act action plan. And that specifically, as he would know, most certainly, is to protect the rights of Indigenous peoples to their culture, identity, language, employment, health, education, and natural resources. Notwithstanding the fact that in 2021, every single Conservative member voted against the adoption of UNDRIP, could the member opposite please tell us how important it is to apply the principles of UNDRIP when working with Indigenous peoples?
The honourable member for Skeena-Bulkley Valley.
The principles are important, but not to the point of where you ignore the High Court case of 2004. Not to the point where you ignore Treaty First Nations. I mean, you're using UNDRIP as a cover to say Bill C-48 is basically needed. It's not needed, especially when First Nations are trying to resolve poverty. I'd put it back to the members on UNDRIP. How has your UNDRIP legislation resolved poverty?
Good question.
Questions and comments. Question et commentaire. The honourable member for Peace River Westlock.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair, Madam Speaker, or Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank the honourable member for his great speech on this. I know that he represents a large rural riding in northern British Columbia, kind of just 2 over from northern Alberta, and I appreciate his comments immensely. He talked about the treaty relationships that we have around the world and getting out from underneath the Indian Act. I know that many people have been, that's a mantra that I think all parties across the House talk about, is getting folks out from underneath the Indian Act. I was wondering if you'd just explain a little bit more what that looked like for his particular community.
The honourable member for Skeena-Bulkley Valley.
Well, resource development like forestry, mining, LNG actually brought in a lot of revenues, employment, and training. And I mentioned already that the Indian Act to me became irrelevant, archaic, except for the funding agreement. But for me, what we did was we segregated Indian Act programs and funding into Indian Act bureaucracy for my departments, my band council. But we created a new structure to deal with government and economic development and politics. And that's what really turned it around for us in what was a short time frame. Within 10 years, we basically no longer needed Indian Act funding. And the issues, the social issues, they started to decrease on their own with no intervention from our band council or government for that matter.
Questions and comments.
The honourable member for Pierre Boucher, Les Patriotes Verchères. Thank you. And I'd like to thank my colleague for a speech that was less about Bill C-10 and more about the importance of oil resource extraction in his province. It's certainly an issue that seems important to my colleague, but Bill C-10 is what we are supposed to be talking about. The government doesn't necessarily have a great record in terms of respecting the rights of Indigenous peoples. We saw this with Bill C-5 back in the spring. It was denounced by all sorts of Indigenous groups, but the government still forced it through. I would like to hear my colleague's opinion on whether the government respects Indigenous rights. I would tend to say that they don't. And if the Conservatives take power, will they respect Indigenous rights more?
No, Bulkley Valley.
Thank you to my member for that question. It's a great question, actually. In fact, it was the Liberal speeches that actually guided me towards economic development issues like forestry, mining, oil, gas. But yes, I agree with my colleague there on saying for the last 10 years, I haven't seen the respect from this Liberal government to First Nations members regarding their rights. And by the way, I'm talking about the rights as defined by the High Court case of 2004. And as Conservatives, I can tell you that we fully respect and will honor that court case of 2004. It actually has all the answers as opposed to what's being proposed by Bill C-10.
Questions and comments. The honourable member for Victoria.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It is frustrating to hear my honourable colleague, who is also from British Columbia, repeating some of the selective amnesia of his fellow members on the other side of the aisle around just how much development has happened in our province over recent years. Despite the member's assertions otherwise, at least 4 major energy projects, Mr. Speaker, including 2 major pipelines, a major natural LNG facility that I know the member knows well, and the Site C Dam have all been constructed in BC with a value value that the Vancouver Board of Trade estimates at around $80 billion for British Columbia's economy. But notwithstanding that, the issue that I question the member on is whether or not he will accept the view of coastal First Nations in our province, who have said very clearly, just in the last week, that they do not support an as yet completely unspecified project from Alberta being built to the BC coast. The member is clear and correct in his assertion of First Nations right and title. He is deeply experienced on this file. Will he respect the rights and title of coastal First Nations in BC?
The honourable member for Skeena-Bulkley Valley.
That is basically what the High Court case of 2004 clearly defines. But let me make it clear. It's the community that owns rights and title. It's not a collective of First Nations. It's not even their leadership, unless the community itself decides who their leadership is. And by the way, the Liberal is talking about respecting Aboriginal rights and title interests. Why did you approve Bill C-48 when you knew full well that Niska Treaty Nation, what we're talking about here, treaty implementation, opposed it? You didn't say anything about that in your press releases, and you still haven't addressed it.
I just remind members to address their comments and questions through the chair. Member for Kenora Kiwatanong.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I really appreciate the comments from my colleague here today, sharing his experience both as an elected member of this place, of the provincial legislature, and of course in his nation as well. He brings a wealth of experience and knowledge. I wonder if he has more commentary on the pattern of this Liberal government making big promises and bringing in very little follow-through afterwards. They're looking once again to create more bureaucracy and throw more money at an issue that they very well have the power to address right now, Mr. Speaker, and I wonder if my colleague has any other thoughts on that.
The honourable member for Skeena-Bulkley Valley.
Thank you, the member, for the question. It's a good question as well. And like I said in my speech, the provisions of the treaty already define what the government is supposed to do, not only in terms of the federal government, but provincial government, and the First Nations as well. What their roles and responsibilities now. Now, this has always been a one-way street, though. First Nations have always gone to the governments and said, can we implement the treaty as outlined in the treaty? Can we do that? And it's always been ignored. So my point in appointing a treaty commissioner is this another level of bureaucracy that the government intends to ignore?
Question et commentaire.
The honourable member for Rimouski Matapedia. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My colleague seems to have experience with this file, but there's something clear to me. There's a contradiction between the Conservatives' intentions today and what we saw back in June. In June, the government tabled Bill C-5, the Major Projects Bill. It was supported by the Conservatives. And they didn't just support it, they allowed time allocation for it. 4 days into a new government, the Conservative Party supporting time allocation. That's a rare thing. Here's the thing about C-5, though. It was roundly criticized by Indigenous communities because there was barely any consultations. They got some letter and 5 days to respond to it. So if my colleague truly wants to advance reconciliation, how come his party supported a bill which saw no consultation of First Nations?
The honourable member for Skeena-Bulkley Valley.
Thank you to the member for the question. Basically, yes, we did support it, but we did want to put protections in, which we debated, and we got in. And by the way, I don't blame the First Nations for their mistrust of this, because in one day the government said First Nations don't have a veto. And I suspect they got that out of the case law, specifically how the court case of 2004. But then the very next day, when they got political pushback, they said they would not do anything without First Nation consent. And then added they would not do anything without national consensus. But in both cases, they didn't define it. But I think we all agree, we all have to build up the economy, we have to get away from the tariffs, and we have to actually rebuild our economy for the sake of Canadians.